Hi and welcome to this presentation. I'm going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls today. I'm sure you have heard of them. What do they mean? How do they affect our faith? You'll see in a while. My name is Sten Johansson and I'll be guiding you through the slides in about 15 minutes. The first scrolls they were found in a cave in Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, and there were a couple of boys, one called Muhammad Edib, meaning Muhammad the Wolf. He and another boy, they were not as old as depicted on this photograph, but they of course got bored. They were taking care of some goats and they started throwing small stones, rocks into caves nearby, and suddenly they heard crackling of pottery. So they went inside and found several scrolls, antique writings. They couldn't decipher it as they were used to the Arabic writing and not the Hebrew writing. So they took it to an antique dealer named Kando, and he sold them on. But now we have discovered them and found out what they mean, and many people agree that it's the biggest archaeological find of the 20th century. You'll see in a while why. So the 7 scrolls that were found were sold. The first ones were bought by an archaeology professor, including the famous Isaiah scroll that was already in 1947, and later a Syrian priest couldn't find out what to do with the other 4 scrolls he had, so he tried to sell them in the United States. Here you can see the advertisement in the paper. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. So they didn't realize what they had in their hands. But they sold it for $250,000 in 1954, and now all of the scrolls are in a museum in Israel. So here's a picture of the museum in Jerusalem called the Shrine of the Book, where they keep the scrolls, some of the jars, so that they will be preserved for us in the future. Of course, some of them are on tour all over the world, but normally they live here. If we look at this satellite picture, we have a big red star marking Qumran, the caves where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and on the left you have a smaller red star, that's Jerusalem. And if you go to Jerusalem, it's up on a mountain, and it's actually a ridge from north to south, and on the western side all the rain is coming down, and on the eastern side you have the desert, the Judean desert, so it can easily go 100 years without any major rain in the Qumran area. It's the lowest point on the face of the earth, so the sea level is, I think, about 200 meters below the ocean level. There are a lot of limestone cliffs, and the caves are usually man-made. Before we look at the caves, just showing a picture where you can see the mountains coming down from Turkey through Israel, going down south towards Africa. So there's a great rift there, and they have frequent earthquakes that also makes some places inaccessible, and you can be sure that some of the caves or the things in it will have collapsed. Here's a picture of the Qumran caves. You can see some of the holes in the limestone cliff. Here's actually cave 1, where they found the most famous Isaiah scroll. Maybe you can see that there are holes in the wall where they might have had shelves or so to place scrolls on. Now it looks very neat, but it didn't. When they started excavating, there were lots of obstacles and lots of fragments that were in pieces. This is probably the most exciting scroll. It's the Isaiah scroll from K1, and the critics hoped that we would never find a scroll like this, as they said that all the prophecies, and especially ones in Isaiah chapter 53, they are so specific, and it's exactly what happened to Jesus. So they were surely written after the time of Jesus, but now we have a copy here, actually 2 copies of Isaiah, complete copies, not in a lot of small fragments, that are more than 100 years before Jesus was even born. Here are just listed 10 parallels between Isaiah chapter 53 and what we can read about Jesus in the New Testament, that he should suffer and be judged, be crucified, put into a grave and resurrected and so on. And it's hard not to think about Jesus, because this is exactly what happened to him, and the Jews find it hard to disprove this. They have written books that are many 100 pages long just to explain why it's not Jesus this small chapter is talking about. So this is a page from the Aleppo Codex. It's one of the oldest existing Hebrew Old Testaments that we have. It's from about 920 AD. So for the last 1,000 years, we have not had any older copies to translate from. So they wrote the Old Testament and then they copied it and made a copy and made a copy, and the copies are gone. And now we're stuck with these documents from 900 and 1000 AD. The Old Testament was actually finished about 400 BC, and the oldest one from 900 AD, Aleppo Codex. So you have a gap there, more than 1,000 years, about 1,300 years, where we don't have any copies. So that's not unusual for ancient documents. If you look into Buddhism or Hinduism, you have even longer gaps. If you look to the Iliad or ancient Greek literature, you have time gaps of about 500 or 1,000 years also. So that's not unusual. But then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and many of them are from 200 BC to 100 AD. So now you have a much shorter gap, 1,000-year shorter gap than before. And that's amazing. Next big question is, how was the transmission for the 1,000 years that we didn't have any copies? Looking at this very famous Isaiah scroll from K1 and focusing on chapter 53 where you have the prophecies. So is it the same? Do we have the prophecies from the time before Christ? When were they copied correctly, or were they added later? And there are actually, in this whole chapter, there are only 17 letters that are different, and 10 of them are spelling differences, so that's a minor thing. 4 are stylistic changes, that's like adding an and or something like that, doesn't change the meaning. And 3 letters were actually added, the word light, in verse 11. So you have just one word out of the 166 words that were changed. And that's totally amazing. They have been copying this for 1,000 years, and they got 165 out of 166 words correctly. So that's kind of mind-blowing. You appreciate that there were professionals doing the copying. And it's not like Chinese whispering. When we do it, after 10 people have whispered the same thing they believe into the next person's ear, it always ends up with something totally different and funny. But the transmission of the Old Testament has been beautiful for 1,000 years. So that's why we call it the biggest discovery, archaeological discovery of the 20th century. We have about 900 documents. There are thousands of fragments. In Cave 4, for instance, you have more than 500 manuscripts, but not one single intact scroll. So it's like a big jigsaw puzzle. It takes a lot of time to match it. Even if you like puzzles, it's a real challenge. It was covered by things falling down, of course, during the earthquakes. But the other major problem was they had been leaving bats for centuries in those caves, and they poop. So there's excrement all over. So it takes a lot of time to find those fragments and clean them and get them to museum and make a jigsaw puzzle and make it fit. And a lot of the pieces are missing, so it's not that easy. Most of the discoveries were between 1947 and 1956. There were 11 man-made caves there at Qumran, and I believe that they are actually looking into more of the caves and finding stuff now in recent years also. So it took a lot of time to translate it, about 40 years. And a big chunk, 40% of it, was unpublished until 1991. So the critics were screaming that it was a conspiracy and they were hidden. But now they are all published and all on the web, so we can download them. Most of it is written in Hebrew, some in Aramaic and in Greek. Most of it was on parchment, also some on papyrus. That's quite normal at that time. Papyrus was a bit expensive though. Most of the documents date between 150 BC and 70 AD. 70 AD was, of course, the Jewish revolt against the Roman occupation, and it started in 66 AD and it ended in 70 AD. Only a small portion, some guys up in Masada, maybe seen the film, they could keep the Romans busy for a couple more years, but that was it. Probably it was the Jewish sect called the Essenes that were living at Qumran, and they hid the Dead Sea Scrolls in about 68 AD. On the left you can see a black and white picture from the Qumran settlement. On the right, on the black and white picture, looks like a big hole. It was a basin where they got the rainwater. Then you can see it looks like a canal, something like an aqueduct they had in those days already, and they were leading also to something looking like a staircase, some stairs going down to a pool. On the right is just a model of how it might have looked. I also want to mention that there are 3 types of manuscripts found in the Qumran caves. They have found almost every book of the Old Testament. Maybe not the book of Esther, but they still have a lot of fragments that they don't know where they fit to. So there could have been a copy of Esther also. The 3 types are biblical manuscripts. That's from the Bible as we know it. There's some apocryphal and pseudepigraphical. That's from the period between the testaments. And there are some from the Essenes, some sectarian manuscripts. For instance, there's a temple scroll. It's the longest one. It's about 8 meters, found in cave 11. And also from 130 BC, there's a copper scroll. And that's unusual. They tried to fold it out and see what it said. And it actually contained 64 hiding places. I think they hid temple artifacts and religious documents. Some of the documents have been in very bad shape, and big companies have been helping, for instance, with infrared imaging to find out if they could get the text enhanced so you can read it, and it's actually working very well. On the left you have a mikveh. There's the stairs going down to the pool where they had a ritual bath, so that was not sprinkling. It was a full body immersion like they had in Jerusalem also when you were going into the temple. Here are some household artifacts, lamps and cooking jars, sandals and bowls, plates, combs, coins of course. You find them whenever you're digging in Israel, you'll find coins. And to the right I've put a picture of a ceramic jar where they usually put the scrolls into. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And now we can be sure that what we thought the Bible was saying in the Old Testament is actually what it was saying 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. The prophecies are true, and they came true. Bye-bye.